Good evening, everyone, and welcome to yet another episode of our UGLE webinar series. My name is Sean Butler, and I am the Communications Manager at UGLE. Now, we have a fascinating topic for you this evening, and I invite you to submit any questions that you may have, and I'll put these to our speaker after he has finished his presentation. Now, our speaker tonight will be known to some of you as the resident medals and militaria expert on the BBC programme The Antiques Roadshow. Mark has had a lifelong passion for military history, and in particular, the medals awarded to British service personnel. When it comes to Freemasonry, Mark is currently the Assistant Grand Sword Bearer and is the Provincial Grand Orator for the province of Essex. And he visits some 40 lodges a year, presenting lectures on military subjects. Now, tonight's lecture is entitled For Valour, the Story of the Victoria Cross, and it will chart the history of the VC, dispel some of the myths, and bring to life some of the stories of the men who have been awarded the country's highest award for bravery. So just to remind you, we will have a Q&A session with Mark at the end, so please do submit your questions in the text box underneath the video. And without further ado, I hand over to Mark Smith. Mark, over to you.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Confusingly, underneath my name on the screen that I've got, it says Roisin McInnery, who is a friend of mine, who lent me the computer. But trust me, I am Mark Smith. So we just got that one out of the way. We're going to have a chat this evening about the Victoria Cross, and we're going to do it in my library here at home. And as you can see, medals have always been a passion. I have collected these things now for some 51 years, and in this very room that I'm sitting in, there are indeed just over 7,500 medals that I've collected over those 51 years. And one of those medals that dear old Dad and I set out all those years ago to get was the Victoria Cross. Back in 2004, I was made the curator of the Royal Artillery Museum down in Woolwich, and I had a tin box, a very small box, about this big, like a $3.99 cash box from Woolworths, and in there were 23 Victoria Crosses. And I thought to myself, I'm going to have to learn a lot more about the men who won these, and indeed more about the cross, because as the curator of the museum, I'm going to have to tell people their stories. So really, that's where this talk started from back in 2004, when I personally needed to know more about the Victoria Cross. So our talk actually starts in the year 1854. And 1854 is the year that the Crimean War started. Now, if you were walking along the street in the 1820s and 30s and 40s, and you came across British soldiers walking towards you, other ranks, what you would have done as the gentle folk that you are, is you would have crossed the road to get away from them. You considered them, without any shadow of doubt, to be scum of the earth, and you really didn't want to have anything to do with them. In 1820, 5 years after the Battle of Waterloo, Lord Wellington said of his own men, "They are the scum of the earth. They fight like lions, but they are the scum of the earth." In the Napoleonic and the 1820s and 30s and 40s, you joined the army in three ways. The first way was quite simple, that you were given an option by a magistrate, so prison or the army. Secondly, you went one night to your local hostelry after a day in the fields or in the new factories. And when you got to your local pub, there were three men outside dressed in red uniform. One had a flag, one had a drum, and the other one was wearing a red sash across his uniform. And that man with the red sash was incredibly friendly. He took you into the pub. He bought you a pint of beer. He engaged you in conversation. He bought you another pint of beer. And then during that conversation, as the beer flowed that evening, at some point during the evening, he pressed into the palm of your hand a shilling. And at that moment, you'd taken the sovereign shilling, and you were now in the British Army. When you woke up in the morning, you had a headache, no doubt. You didn't have a shilling anymore because the recruiting sergeant had helped you to drink that, because recruiting is thirsty work. But by God, you were in the British Army. And the third way was that you presented yourself to a barracks. You became a simple volunteer, and in their words, you went for a soldier. They also gave you a shilling, and you were in the British Army. But the organisation that you had just joined is a very brutal organisation. On the statute until 1867, the punishment for dirty buttons on parade was quite simply hanging. The punishment for not wearing the leather stock that held your head at exactly the right angle was 300 lashes. And if you go to the National Archives at Kew and you read through some of these chaps' actual service papers that still exist, these are not hollow threats. These happened to people, and it was a very brutal world that you had just joined. Now, in 1854, when the Crimean War started, it was these men that we sent as an expeditionary force to the Crimea to fight the Russians. Now, when we think about wars today, or in fact anything, even Mr. Trump's election, as we're here, sitting here now, if we want to find out about something like that, we can watch it live on television. And everything that we do, we now watch live pretty much on television. It comes from all over the world. But for a Victorian, news about wars in particular came from countries which were a very, very long way away. And in some cases, you would have needed an atlas to find out where that country was. And when that news eventually turned back up here in England, it was anything up to about 3 months old. Now, the Crimean War is our first sort of technologically advanced war. So an electric telegraph had been laid from London under the Channel, through France, down into the Balkans and up into the Crimea itself. And this was a Morse code relay station, set of posts. And this allowed the force commander, a man called Lord Raglan, to actually send a message from the Crimea all the way back to London, and then receive a message within sort of 16 to 20 hours, which, if you think about how far away the Crimea is from England, even today, in the 1850s, that is really quite spectacular. With the expeditionary force, we sent 2 men. One was a man called Mr. Russell. He was a reporter for the Times newspaper. And the other one was a guy called Roger Fenton. And Roger Fenton was a very newfangled type of professional. He was a photographer. Now, Mr. Russell was allowed to use that electric telegraph to send back a dispatch once a week to the Times newspaper. And Roger Fenton was allowed to send back on the returning transport ships his glass plate negatives of his photographs. So on the 25th of October, 1854, the Light Brigade charged into the valley. On the 6th of November, 1854, just a few days later, really, that story was in the Times newspaper. And in the Illustrated London News that week, there was one of Roger Fenton's photographs. It had now been turned into an etching, but it actually showed you the valley that they had charged along. And when he took the photograph, the Russian cannonballs were still lying on the floor, all dotted along the valley itself. So you were right there. And Mr. Russell's story is still, and was then, fantastic. Now, I sit here in my study, my library, in front of a fireplace. I have my Madeira behind me, and I sit in one of my favourite leather armchairs. And you have to imagine now that you're a Victorian, and it's that November of 1854, and you're sitting in a room like this, and you start to read Mr. Russell's story of the charge. Now, all of his stories are fantastic. And as you sit reading, he takes you from your leather armchair to that very place. So now you are no longer in your chair, you're now sitting on your horse, and you can feel the horse moving. You can hear, as he's writing, you can hear the jingling of the horse bits. And then as they start to move down that valley, you go with them. And as the momentum increases, and as eventually as the charge is blown on the bugle, you go with them and you go down that valley. The charge itself remarkably lasted for 7 minutes. That is the charge of the Light Brigade. And Mr. Russell's story takes about 7 minutes to read. So you really are there in the thick of the action. Now, as Mr. Russell's story started to come back to England, the general population started to say, well, do you know, have you read about what our soldiers are doing out in the crowd? They're very good. So they're Her Majesty's soldiers. I mean, obviously, they're the best in the world. And the entire opinion of what the population thought about British soldiers started to change. And purely really because Mr. Russell was writing these stories and he was telling you things that had happened only just a week before. They were such good stories and you were enthralled that suddenly you were worrying about soldiers being killed. You were incredulous at how brave some of these chaps were actually being. And momentum got behind this, and eventually the public said, well, we're reading about these things that these chaps are doing, and they're so brave. What reward is there for such acts of bravery on the battlefield? And again, this got momentum, and it went as a question to the House of Commons. And the House of Commons answered it by saying, well, in 1854, the Army instituted a brand new medal called the Distinguished Conduct Medal. This is a Distinguished Conduct Medal, and this one was won by a man at the Battle of the Alma in 1854. But this is the highest award for bravery that we had at that time. And the public said, well, that's very good. And then the House of Parliament said, well, not to be outdone, the Royal Navy, in January 1855, they instituted this, which is called the Conspicuous Gallantry Medal. And that is the highest award for bravery for the Royal Navy for other ranks. And the population said, well, that is absolutely excellent. What about officers? And they said, now, officers. Well, we got a bit of a problem with officers. First of all, they're supposed to be brave. That's why they're officers. And if they're going to do something that is going to come to our notice, then it's going to have to be above and beyond what we would expect of them normally. But the real problem is we just don't have anything to give them. There is a medal called the Companion of the Bath, but it's not really for bravery, and it just doesn't really quite fit. And the public said, well, we understand, and we like the Distinguished Conduct Medal and the Conspicuous Gallantry Medal, but what we believe is that there should be one reward, the ultimate award for bravery. It should be for the Army and the Navy, and it should cover all ranks. Now, again, this got momentum. It went from the House of Commons to the House of Lords, and after a fair few weeks, it landed on the desk of a man called Lord Panmure, who also was a Freemason. Lord Panmure at the time was the Secretary of State for War, and it was he who got the task of taking this idea of the ultimate award for bravery to Her Majesty Queen Victoria. He actually got an audience with Prince Albert. He went in, he met with the Prince, he took paperwork with him to show and to explain what the public were asking for. And Prince Albert said, I think Her Majesty will be very excited about this. So leave your paperwork with me, and I will call you back to the palace when I've had a chance to talk to her. Just on about a month later, Lord Panmure was asked to come back to the palace. He met again with Prince Albert, and in the desk in front of Prince Albert was laid out the paperwork that Lord Panmure had brought with him a month or so before. But now, as Lord Panmure looked across the desk at the paperwork, he could see that every single page of the paperwork he bought had now been annotated in green ink handwriting, the hand of Queen Victoria herself. She'd written in every space, every margin, everywhere. And on the very first page, at the top, she had written the Victoria Cross. So she told us what it would be called, and she also told us what it would look like. It would be a cross. In amongst all of those writings, in one margin, Her Majesty had written, "I do not want this medal to be made of something precious. I do not want this medal to be worth money, because it's not about the medal, it's about the deed behind the medal. That's the important thing." Prince Albert said to Lord Panmure, "Her Majesty is very excited about this. What she would like you to do is to go away and to come back with 4 models that she can choose from." Now, Her Majesty has seen a medal. It comes from the Peninsular War, 1808 to 1814, and it is called the Army Gold Cross. And Her Majesty thinks that would be quite a good model for this new medal, the Victoria Cross. Now, the Army Gold Cross is a thing called a cross pate. So the arms of the cross are wide at the top, and they come and narrow as they get closer to the middle, and all 4 of them do the same. And on the Army Gold Cross on the front, there is a lion, a proud lion, which is a separate piece, and it's brazed onto the front, and there's another one on the back. They're a bit bigger than Victoria Crosses, and they are also made of 22 karat gold, a solid block of gold. I weighed one once and asked one of those cash for gold places, and just for the gold alone, with no historical data whatsoever, it was worth £80,000 just for the lump of gold. The man who made the models, he based one of them on this cross pate and the lion. And what he did was he made the cross pate, so the cross with the wide arms at the top, coming down to a middle. And in the middle, he put a crown. And on the crown, he stood the lion. And under the lion, he put a banner. And on the banner, he put the word "for bravery." Her Majesty went through the models, and this was the one that she chose. But then she said, "This wording, for bravery, this will not do. All of my soldiers and sailors are brave. I want it to say for valour." And they are the only 2 words on the front of a Victoria Cross. Her Majesty then said, "How will you join the cross to the ribbon?" And they said, "Well, Your Majesty, the ribbon will end in some sort of a metal bar. There will then be a ring or a loop of some description, and that will go through the top of the cross." And Her Majesty said, again, showing how much this really was her medal, she said, "I want you to incorporate the letter V for Victoria into the suspension device." "Certainly, Your Majesty." Her Majesty then said, "What can we make it of?" And they said, "Well, what did you want us to make it of?" And she said, "Well, I don't want it to be made of anything precious. So could we try copper?" "Yes, Your Majesty." They went away, they came back with a copper version of the Victoria Cross, and they showed it to Her Majesty, and she looked at it and she said, "This will not do. My soldiers and sailors will be very proud of this, and they will polish it, and it will go pink, and it will look like an old penny. What else can we make it of?" And the man said, "Well, could we try bronze, Your Majesty?" They went away, they came back with a bronze version of the cross, and Her Majesty said, "Yes, that's the one." And on the 29th of January 1856, she signed the statute that created the Victoria Cross. Now, a man got a job to go to all of the jewellers in London to try and find someone to make this thing. Now, you would think that would be quite simple, but it turned out to be dreadful, because all of the jewellers that he went to, pretty much all of them said no, because it wasn't made of gold and diamonds. The moment they said bronze, they didn't want to do it. But he did eventually find a jeweller's on the corner of New Bond Street and Bruton Street, called Hancock's. It had only been open for about 5 years. He went in, he met with Mr. Hancock, the jeweller, and he said to him, "Look, would you like to make a medal for Her Majesty?" Now, Mr. Hancock, open 5 years, bit of a shrewd businessman, can already see that by appointment sign appearing in his window. He said yes. Brilliant, making him probably the second most famous jeweller in the world, behind Fabergé, because we've all heard of Fabergé. But they're still so famous because it is still Hancock's, the jewellers today, who still make the Victoria Crosses. Now, back in 2004, just at the end of the year, I went to Hancock's, the jewellers, and I met with a man called David Callahan, who was the managing director, and he showed me all of the paperwork they have for the VC. Wow, what an afternoon this was. Big ledgers, leather-bound ledgers that you opened, and there in copper plate handwriting was every detail you can imagine. The name of the man who was going to supply the ribbon, the pins, come back to them in a minute, the cardboard boxes, the man who was going to do the engraving on the back of the man's name for a farthing a letter. Absolutely incredible. And then in a little tiny book, every engraving that had ever been put on every Victoria Cross, and they're all slightly different, which is how Hancocks know whether it's a real one or not. But the detail was incredible. Now, we all know that the Victoria Cross is made of bronze taken from a cannon, which was captured from the Russians at Sevastopol. And I said to David Callahan, where is the paperwork for the arrival of the cannon from the Crimea? And he said, yeah. He said, we don't actually have anything like that. I said, but when did the cannon arrive so you could make the medals? And he said, no, we never got a cannon. No. What we actually used was just a stock piece of bronze. So I said, so they're not made of Russian cannons? No, they're not. They are made probably of a piece of a cannon, but it's just a stock piece of bronze. So I personally was crushed, because I'd always known the story that our highest award for bravery was made from a Russian cannon, but it wasn't. We move on to the 26th of June, 1857. And in Hyde Park that day, lined up on a parade, were the first 62 men to be awarded the Victoria Cross. Now, you need to know a couple of things about the Victoria Cross before we go on. First of all, the ribbon for the Army Victoria Cross was red, and for the Royal Navy, it was blue. The other thing you need to know at this point is that there are no posthumous awards of the VC. It says in the statute for the Victoria Cross that you must still be alive at the end of the action to claim your cross. If you were wounded in an action, you were recommended for a Victoria Cross, the recommendation came back to London, and before it got signed off, you died, no VC. What you got was one line in the London Gazette that said, would have been awarded a Victoria Cross had he lived. So there are no posthumous VCs. The 62 men lined up in Hyde Park, they had practiced all week. It was a very big affair. And the week before, in the Times newspaper, on the 18th of June, 1857, the Times ran a column about this big parade. And in the column, the journalist wrote, next week, Her Majesty will present 62 of the new medals, the Victoria Cross. They are made of a very mean piece of metal. They are made of bronze, taken from a cannon, captured from the Russians at Sevastopol. And that's where the story comes from. It's just a newspaper story. There we go. So the 62 men are lined up, and the first man in the queue is a man called Commander Raby, Royal Navy. He wasn't the first man to win the VC, but in the day, he was the first man who was going to be presented with the new medal. They practiced all week for Her Majesty to arrive in a carriage, dismount, go up onto a dais. Her Majesty had been told that a cushion will arrive next to you. The Victoria Cross will be on the cushion. At the top of the ribbon at the back, just like a Masonic jewel, not one, but there will be two spikes, steel spikes, about 1.5 inches long. Her Majesty had been told to take the medal from the cushion, place her thumb on the top of the ribbon on the front, but onto the bar. So the two pins were now sticking down at the back. Place the two pins onto the gentleman's coat and press. On the big day, Her Majesty arrived not in the carriage as expected, but she came on horseback, riding side saddle. She rode up to the dais. She stopped. She got off. She didn't get off. She stayed mounted. Sorry, didn't get off. She stayed mounted. And all of the queue of men waiting had to shuffle off to their left a bit, so they were now still in front of her. The cushion arrived next to the horse with a blue ribboned Victoria Cross for Commander Raby. They gave him the nod, and Commander Raby marched smartly up to Her Majesty. He stopped in front of the horse. She leant down, picked up the Victoria Cross, put her thumb on the bar, and put the 2 pins onto his jacket and pressed, just as the horse moved, pressing the 2 pins straight into his chest. They carried him off of parade, bless him, laid him down on the floor, opened his jacket, watched the blood stain spread across his lovely white shirt. And he has 2 quotes from the day. The first quote he said was, "I did not feel I could make a fuss, as I was given the highest award for bravery." And his second quote that day was, "I was more badly injured receiving it than I was winning it." Bless him. She stabbed another 2 men in the queue that day as well. Not good. We move on. The 9th of October, 1862, out on the China station, there were 4 ships in Her Majesty's service. One of those ships was a ship called HMS Sphinx. On board HMS Sphinx was a man called able seaman George Hinckley. Now, this is during the Opium War, and warlords are holding court in big towns all around China and stopping the opium moving. And we've gone there to stop them. Now, the force commander of the 4 ships asked for volunteers from the sailors to form something called a naval landing party. George Hinckley volunteered. They marched inland. George went with them. And their target was a place called Fenghua. It was a big walled city. When they got there, the wall of the actual front of the city that presented itself to them was about 200 yards long, with a big gate in the middle of it and castellations along the top. In front of the wall, about 200 yards wide and about 200 yards deep, was a completely open market square, no cover at all, and just empty. Down the left-hand side of this, if you were attacking it, were some houses. And down the right-hand side of the square was a stream and broken ground, so very difficult to maneuver on. But at about the 200-yard mark away from the gate was a ditch. The sailors got into the ditch. They waited until the whistles blew, and then they made a frontal assault onto the gate itself. And they were met by murderous fire, truly murderous fire. And they were beaten back, dreadful casualties. They fell back to the ditch. And when the gun smoke cleared, there, out in the middle of the square, about 100 yards out, was a wounded sailor waving for help. And as he started to wave, all of the sailors, all of the Chinese along the top of the wall, started to shoot at him. George Hinckley saw this, and of his own volition, he climbed out of the ditch and he ran the 100 yards under fire to where the wounded man was lying. He picked him up, put him over his shoulder under fire, and then ran him back to the ditch. He got in the ditch, and we're told he wasn't satisfied with just getting him to a place of safety, but then he pushed his way along the ditch until he found the doctor, and he laid the wounded man at the feet of the doctor. George then turned round just in time to see a wounded man at the gate, 200 yards away, waving for assistance. This time George climbed out of the ditch and he ran the whole 200 yards under fire to the gate. He picked up his man, worked out he wouldn't get back, and he ran diagonally across the battlefield to one of the houses at the side of the square and to a place of safety. And George was awarded the Victoria Cross for that action. He was given it by Queen Victoria in January 1863 in Hyde Park. And this, on its Royal Navy blue ribbon, is George's Victoria Cross. You can see the V here for Victoria. It's a lovely thing. Look at that. Aren't they gorgeous? And very small, but superb. Okay, so I'm going to have to presume, because I can't hear any of you today, if you have seen the film Zulu with Michael Caine. So in the film Zulu, the film is based on the defense of a place called the Rorke's Drift Mission Station. It was, in fact, in historical terms, it was defended by B Company of the 24th Foot. They will become the South Wales Borderers later. But there were 124 men who were left behind at the Rorke's mission station, whilst a large column of about 2,500 British soldiers advanced away from them. They were there to hold the river crossing as they crossed. The column crossed the thing called the Buffalo River into Zululand. The column split into two, and the northern part of the column marched into Zululand and got to a place called Isandlwana. It's a big mountain, and they camped around the bottom of this big mountain. They put their tents up. They started to cook dinner. They went into sort of a camp routine. They'd been there now, I don't know, 3, 4, 5 hours. And around about lunchtime, they were attacked by a Zulu force that numbered somewhere between 18 and 20,000 Zulu. And they killed 1,300 British soldiers. I mean, it is the biggest disaster. The whole column was wiped out. About 40 blokes got away from this, but actually everyone was massacred. It is the biggest disaster that we had ever suffered in military history up to that moment in time. That was the morning of the 22nd of January 1879. Another Zulu unit went past Isandlwana whilst the battle was raging and marched on the Drift mission station at Rorke's Drift. The 124 men, kept the mission station defended against a Zulu force that is believed to have numbered somewhere between 4,500 and 5,000 Zulu. And they held the mission station against repeated attacks by this Zulu force for about 33 hours. And they were awarded, whatever you want to call it, but they won the most Victoria Crosses ever won by one unit in one day. They won 11 Victoria Crosses that day. Now you know they're not posthumous. How many more may they have got had they also been a posthumous award? But it is the most glorious day in British military history. The morning, though, at Isandlwana, the biggest disaster, there were two officers of the 24th Foot at Isandlwana called Lieutenants Coghill and Melville. They were both Freemasons, just so we can say that, but they were, bless them. They were both wounded. They were both mounted on horses, and they'd also both worked out that the battle was completely lost. And the last thing that they thought they might be able to do to save any honour from the day was to try and save the colours, the flag of the regiment. So they got the colours, they rode off of the battlefield. They were seen by the Zulu who followed them. They got to a river crossing. Today it's called Fugitives Drift. Coghill got across the river. Melville, his friend who had the flag, he turned round on his horse to see where his friend was, and poor Melville had only managed to get about a quarter of the way across the river, and he was now being surrounded by the Zulu. So Coghill was free. He'd done it. He got away. He was safe. But bless him, he turned his horse round and he went back into the river. He went back to help his friend Melville. The Zulus killed both of them. They actually captured the flag and took it to King Kechewayo, the king of the Zulu, and disaster. However, from some of the survivors of the 40-odd men who came back after the battle, the story of what Coghill and Melville had tried to do was made public, and it got into the newspapers. And public opinion again said, these two men must have a Victoria Cross. I mean, that is exactly what a Victoria Cross is for. The honour of the regiment. They were wounded. They tried to help each other. That's what this is all about. And it went as a petition again to the House of Commons, House of Lords, and it got itself all the way to Queen Victoria herself, who said, no, they didn't live. They can't have one. It says in the statute, you've got to be alive. And the public said, well, Your Majesty, you've read the story. Could you not change the statute and make it so that they could have one? And she said, no. So for the rest of her life and the rest of her reign, she was petitioned for a VC for Coghill and Melville, and she turned it down every time. When Edward VII came to the throne, again, they petitioned him And eventually, after many years, 5 years, now in 1907, eventually Edward VII relented, and he changed the statute, and he made a posthumous provision for the VC. And the second thing he did that day was he backdated 2 posthumous Victoria Crosses for Coghill and Melville. So they did get their Victoria Crosses. Now that's quite prophetic, really, because 7 years later is 1914, and that's the start of the Great War. And between 1914 and 1918, 643 men won the Victoria Cross, and 211 of them were killed winning it. And when we think about VCs today, they are very much a posthumous award. Now, something else happened in 1914, and that was that whatever that block of metal was that Hancock's the jewellers were using to make the Victoria Crosses, it ran out. Hancock's wrote to the War Office. The War Office had read that newspaper story of the fact that it was supposed to be made from a Russian gun, and they liked that idea that it was made from a captured enemy gun. So they sent a signal down to the Royal Arsenal at Woolwich, and they said, we want you to find 2 guns. They must have been captured in a battle, they must be of foreign manufacture, and they must be made of bronze. They chose 2 guns, which stood in the foyer of my museum. I used to walk past them every morning on my way to my office. And the 2 guns that they chose had been captured by the Royal Regiment of Artillery in 1860 at a place called the Taku Forts. And in fact, the 2 guns that they chose to make the Victoria Cross from 1914 onwards and still up to today were actually Chinese guns. So they are made of guns, but they're not Russian, they are Chinese, and they didn't start using the real thing, as it were, until 1914. But between them, the 2 guns have made just over 800 Victoria Crosses so far between them. Now, on the 1st of July 1916, the British Army attacked on the Somme. It was a very sunny Saturday morning. They were fairly convinced, the lads who were in the trenches, that they were going to win that day. The whistles blew that Saturday morning at 7:30. They went over the top, and really the attack lasted about an hour. And at the end of the hour, the attack had bogged down, and the British Army had taken 18,311 fatal casualties, and 42,000 men had been wounded in 1 hour. And during that hour, the British Army won 9 Victoria Crosses. One of them was awarded to a man called Lionel Reese. Now, Lionel is a little bit different because Lionel is a fighter pilot in the Royal Flying Corps. He was actually flying over the attack on that Saturday morning with a wingman, and his wingman disappeared. No one knows what happened to him. He's still missing to this day. But Lionel pressed on, and at some point he saw a formation of British bombers coming back from the German side. And he thought to himself, I'll go up and I'll escort them home. So he flew up, got in amongst the aircraft, and at that moment he worked out that he'd made a bit of a mistake, because they in fact were all Germans, and all of the Germans all opened fire on him. Now, one bullet came through the side of his aircraft. Remember, they're just made of canvas. Sorry about this, bit gruesome, but it severed Lionel's right leg through the thigh bone, and the bottom part of his leg dropped into the cockpit. He rolled out of combat and knew he was in trouble, and his biggest problem was the artery. So he fished about inside the stump of his leg until he got the artery, and he closed it with his thumb and his forefinger. He then picked up his leg, put the foot back in the rudder pedal, keeping the artery shut. He then held the 2 stumps together so he could push on the rudder pedal, and he went back up into the combat holding the artery shut. He shot down 2 Germans that day, and he didn't roll out of combat until he had run out of ammunition. He flew his little aeroplane home. He landed it on the airfield, and what usually happened was he had a little dog, and his little dog used to run from the crew hut towards him, and he'd jump out the aircraft and they'd meet somewhere in the middle. And on this occasion, the little dog got all the way to the aircraft, and the ground crew thought, oh, something wrong, and they ran over. They got to Lionel sitting in his cockpit, 2 stumps pushed together holding the femoral artery shut, and they said to him, are you all right? And bless him, he said, I could do with a bit of help getting out. He was awarded the Victoria Cross. August 1940, the Battle of Britain. A man called Jimmy Nicholson. It was his first day in combat. It wasn't a scramble. He went up with a wingman on a familiarization flight. They were flying around, and what they didn't see, either of them, was a German Messerschmitt 110 come up behind Jimmy Nicholson's Hurricane. The guy opened fire, and the cannon shells hit Jimmy's aircraft, and he said it was the loudest bang I've ever heard. They blew most of his right foot away. It blinded him in one eye, and it set light to his Hurricane. Just a sea of flame. He swung the hood back, undid the little door, got his harness out, climbed out onto the wing ready to bail out, and the Messerschmitt 110 flew past him. So instead of bailing out, Jimmy climbed back into his burning Hurricane. And he said afterwards, I held the throttle open with my hand in the flames. I watched my glove burn off. I watched the skin of my hand burn off, and I would watch the bones of my hand catch fire. And then I shot him down. He rolled his aircraft, then he bailed out. He was in a very bad way, lost most of his foot, blind in one eye, 70% burnt. He couldn't get his oxygen mask off. He never said he knew how he got the parachute to open, but he did. He came down on a parachute, and he needed help. And he saw, riding along on a bicycle down a lane, a kid. He turned out to be a 14-year-old lad who was a errand boy for a butcher's. But he started to shout at this kid, and all of a sudden this kid sort of looked up and went, yes, and started to pedal to the field where he thought Jim was going to come in and land. And as this little boy got there on his bicycle, the Home Guard turned up. They all jumped out of the van, and one of them, just as Jim touched down, he shot him with a double-barrel shotgun. So when the cottage ambulance arrived, which could only take one person, they looked at Jim, 70% burnt, lost his left foot, blind in one eye, and they looked at the Home Guard man. And they said, we'll take the Home Guard bloke because he's worse hurt. So they put the Home Guard guy in the ambulance and drove away, leaving Jim in the field. And the reason that he was now so badly injured, the Home Guard chap, is because our butcher's boy was so incensed that he'd actually broken the shotgun over this bloke's head for shooting Jim. Now, today, there'd be a helicopter and emergency medical technicians and oxygen, but no, bless, 1940, we picked Jim up and they carried him down to the local pub, and they gave him half a bitter, and they waited for the ambulance to come back. He's the only fighter pilot from the Battle of Britain to be awarded the Victoria Cross. He was actually in hospital for 3 years. And at some point, he was one of Archibald McIndoe's guinea pigs. And Archibald McIndoe said to him, Jim, this hand, I'm sorry, it's ruined. There's nothing I can do with this. So what we're going to do is we're going to do an operation on it, and we're going to set it. So the question is, do you want us to set it so that you can hold a pint of beer? Or do you want us to set it so that you can hold a cigar? And Jim thought for a bit, and he said to Archibald McIndoe, he said, can you set it so that I can hold the throttle quadrant on a Hurricane? And it was set so he could do that. And before the war was over, Jim had in fact shot down another 6 German aircraft, the only VC for the Battle of Britain. Now, if you go out onto the battlefield and you win a Gallantry award, they give you the first medal. Then if you go out and you win another one at the same level, they don't give you 2 medals. What they do is they give you a little strip of metal that you sew on the ribbon of the first one. This little strip of metal represents the second award, and it is called the bar. Out of the 1,365 men who have won the Victoria Cross, 3 men have won the Victoria Cross twice. The first man to do it was a man called Arthur Martin Leake. Now, Arthur was a doctor. The year was 1900, and he was in South Africa fighting the Boer, and he had been told that there were 3 wounded British soldiers out in front of the guns. He went out with his medical bag. He got to the wounded chaps, knelt down, started to tend to them, and a Boer saw him and shot him 3 times with a rifle. And out of everybody out there now, Arthur is the most badly wounded. The stretcher bearers came out with 3 stretchers. They looked at Arthur and said, and Arthur said, no, leave me. These boys have been out longer. They need a drink. Get them in first. They took them in. They came back for Arthur. They took him back to the tent, his own tent, his hospital tent. And now they've got a problem because he's the doctor. So they went off to look for another doctor. And when they came back with somebody else, Arthur, bless him, even though the most grievously wounded, he climbed off of his stretcher and he was crawling round the tent, tending to all of the other wounded. And for that, they gave him the Victoria Cross. In October 1914, still a doctor in the British Army, he found himself outside of a Belgian town called Ypres. And this was just as the trenches were being put in. The barbed wire was new, and the bit in between we call no man's land, that hadn't even been coined by the newspapers yet. But they said to Arthur one day, there's a man out there right up by the German wire. Well, in fact, he's all caught up in the wire. He's wounded, and that's why we can't get him in, because he's so tangled, we just can't get him in. So Arthur waited until it was dark. He got a pair of wire cutters. He climbed over the top and he walked slowly towards the German trenches, and they started to shoot at him, and he just kept going. And eventually a German officer worked out what he was trying to do, and he stopped all of his men firing. Arthur kept going. He got to the wounded man in the wire, used the wire cutters, cut round him, released him, put him over his shoulder, and walked back to the British trenches. And for that, he was awarded the first ever bar to the Victoria Cross. The second man to do it was a man called Noel Chavas. This is Noel here. I'll show you a picture of him. There he is. He's a Royal Army Medical Corps, but he was attached to the 10th Battalion, the King's Liverpool Regiment. And in September 1916, the 10th Battalion, the King's Liverpool Regiment, were tasked with an attack on the Somme of a village called Guillemont. They went over the top and were cut down by machine gun fire. Noel waited until it was dark, and then he went over the top himself, but he went over on his own, and he went out into no man's land. And at times we are told that he got within 25 yards of the German front line. He was wounded 9 times that night while he was out there in no man's land. But while he was out there, he, on his own, rescued from the shell holes 21 wounded men. He was awarded the Victoria Cross. On the 31st of July 1917, if you are a historian, you will call that the first day of the Third Battle of Ypres. It's better known as the first day of Battle of Passchendaele. The 10th Battalion were up in the top sort of right-hand corner of the salient, Ypres salient, and they were tasked with an attack on a village called Saint-Julien. Now, Noel had built his dressing station, as he always did, as close to his boys as he could, and on this occasion he built it in the front line itself. And just as they got ready to go and the whistles were ready to blow, a shell came over, went down the steps of his dressing station and exploded. Now, it blew most of the side of his face off, it fractured his skull, and it put 2 holes in him here, the size of fists. They bandaged Noel up, they got him on a stretcher. He climbed off the stretcher and he said, I'm the doctor, I'm staying. They're my boys, they need me. So wounded as he was, he stayed in that dugout, operating on the soldiers as they were brought in wounded by the stretcher bearers, and he stayed in there for 3 days and 3 nights. On the second night, a stretcher bearer team came in and they said to him, we found a man in no man's land who is so badly wounded we can't even roll him onto a stretcher. What do you want us to do, sir? And we all believed that they thought he was going to say shoot him. But what Noel actually said was, take me to him. So they went out in the dark, under shellfire, into no man's land, into a shell hole. They found this bloke. Noel got out a little tiny lamp. He did an operation on him in the mud, stabilized him, got him on the stretcher, got him back to the dugout, did another operation on him, and then sent him off down the line. And we are told that that man survived. What Noel hadn't told anybody was when he was doing that first operation, he'd been hit in the back of the head by a piece of shrapnel from a bursting shell, and he then proceeded to remove that from the back of his own head in his own dugout. At the end of the third day, they said to Noel, "Look, you've done it. There's nobody else that you can help. They're all in, or they're being looked after by someone else now. Here's a stretcher. Away you go. You've done your job." And Noel said, "Well, I will go, but there's people worse hurt than me, so I'll walk." So he set off on a 5-mile walk from Saint Julien to a little tiny village called Brandhoek. And this is where number 3 casualty clearing station was. And whilst he was on the walk, at some point, there was some shell fire. Noel threw himself on the floor. He managed to push this bandage out of the way, and he filled these 2 holes in his stomach with mud. Picked himself up, kept on walking, got to the dressing station, and the doctor in charge that night, who was there to look after him as he came in, was none other than Arthur Martin Leake, the only other man at that point to have won 2 Victoria Crosses. Arthur did an operation on Noel and then looked after him all of the next day as Noel slowly died of blood poisoning from the mud in the 2 holes in his stomach. But he was awarded the bar to the Victoria Cross. The last man to win 2 bars is a man called Charlie Uppam. Now, Charlie is a New Zealand soldier, and he was very much a fighting soldier. He was a sergeant in 1941. He was in Crete, and the German paratroopers were dropping all around them as they tried to make their way back to the port. So if you imagine like another Dunkirk, and Charlie was in charge of the rear guard. They were leapfrogging over another platoon. They got to where they got to, and the Germans had arrived behind them and set up a machine gun post on a crossroads. And Charlie said he'd been wounded 7 times that day by a shrapnel and things. He said to his men, "Look, we've reached the point where it's all over. It's every man for himself now, and there's no more we can do. But someone's got to knock out that machine gun. I'll do it." So he pulled out a hand grenade. He ran over. He knocked out the machine gun post. He got wounded while he was doing it. Bless him again. The platoon took him back to North Africa. His wounds were healed, and he was awarded the VC. In 1942, a place called the Rusiat Ridge, which is part of a kidney-shaped ridge, south of which is something called the Katara Depression or the Great Sand Sea. So it's just desert. You can't get a tank through it. And then to the north of the Rusiat Ridge is a 40-mile open expanse of desert. And on the coast, there's a railway station called El Alamein. Now, you can't go through the Sand Sea if you're the Germans because the tanks won't work. You can't really attack 40 miles of British soldiers in depth, but you can take the Rusiat Ridge. And if you can come up behind the British. You can get to the coast by El Alamein. You can turn basically right, and then it's a run for Cairo. And if the Germans had done that, we actually would have probably lost World War II. So October 42, Rommel puts in a big attack on the Rusiat Ridge, and up there is Charlie Upham. He was wounded early on. A bullet went through his right elbow and his arm didn't work. But in his citation for the bar to his Victoria Cross, it says, after being wounded, Captain Upham destroyed 4 German machine gun posts, 4 German lorries, and captured 35 prisoners, single-handed, only one arm. And he was the 3rd man ever to be awarded the bar to the Victoria Cross. Now, as we get to the end of this, sometimes in the questions I'm asked, what is the difference between the Victoria Cross and the George Cross? Well, as you now know, you've all seen the Victoria Cross. So here is a Victoria Cross again. That's George's one. But here is a George Cross. And they are slightly different in that they're made of a different metal. This one is made of silver. And even though they have both blue ribbons, this is always blue. But now, as we know, from 1916 onwards, these are now red for the Army and the Navy. Now, if you think about the George Cross and the Victoria Cross, what a lot of people say to me is that the George Cross is for civilians and the Victoria Cross is for soldiers. Well, no, that's not true, because 4 civilians have won the Victoria Cross. And out of about the 480 people who have been awarded a George Cross, about half of them are indeed service people. If you are going to write a citation for a Victoria Cross or a George Cross today, the Ministry of Defence will quite helpfully send you an email with a pack of how to write the citation. And for the George Cross and for the Victoria Cross, both, it says, you must demonstrate that there was a 90% chance or greater that this person would have been killed attempting this feat. So the actual action, what you have to do is exactly the same for the two medals. The difference is that the Victoria Cross must be won in the face of the enemy, and the George Cross, same amount of bravery, but not in the face of the enemy. Now, this lad here is a guy called Arthur Aaron. Arthur is a airman. He was 20 years old when this story occurred. He was the pilot of a Halifax bomber, and on this particular occasion, it was his 19th operational trip. He'd been to Berlin, Hamburg, the Ruhr, Essen. He knew what he was doing, bless him. But on this particular occasion, the whole squadron, 12 aircraft, were tasked with bombing the oil refinery in Milan in Italy. Now, I don't live too far away from Stansted Airport, and if you get an EasyJet flight out to Milan, it's about an hour and 45 minutes. If you're in a Halifax bomber in World War II, the round trip is about 8.5 hours, and most of that is done in the dark over France, where the night fighters live. So this is a very dangerous trip. They had a huge bomb load. They were carrying a thing called a cookie, which is a 4,000-pound blast bomb. They had 10 1,000-pounders and some incendiaries. They got over to the Alps. They started onto their bomb run, and they were attacked. Bullets came through the windscreen. They destroyed the instrument panel. They killed the navigator. They hit the wireless operator. They hit the wireless set and knocked it out of action. And they knocked out of action the port inner engine. And the port inner engine stopped straight away, but that runs the APU, the auxiliary power unit, and this provides all of your hydraulic power for your aircraft. So the brakes, the flaps, the wheels, and the gun turrets. And if you're not in exactly the right position in a gun turret, you can't open the doors to get your parachute. And when the hydraulics failed on the aircraft, the rear turret was off to one side and it trapped the rear gunner in the turret. Bullets came through the windscreen. They hit Arthur. They blew his bottom jaw off. He lost his tongue. He lost most of his face. He lost his left arm at the elbow, and 2 bullets hit him in the chest. His aircraft dropped, but he righted it. They got him onto a rest bed. They did an enormous amount of first aid on him. The pilot, the flight engineer, took over flying it. Never done that before, and they decided that they would fly on. Not go home, but try to get back to Sicily, which in 1943 we just captured. They dropped the bombs, make themselves lighter. They flew down the coast of Italy, using it as the sort of the geographical marker, because all the maps were gone and the navigator was dead. And they reached Sicily. They'd sent an SOS, and Sicily were ready for them, but they said, "Look, you've got to wait because we've got to get some other aircraft in." So they waited and circled the airfield whilst 9 Wellington bombers came in. They waited a bit longer, another one came in, and then there was one more, and he came in trailing black smoke. They'd been hit over the target somewhere, bless him, and as he landed, his wheels collapsed and the aircraft blew up on the runway. So what we now asked our novice pilot of several hours to do, never flown an airplane, is to come in with an open Bombay aircraft with no wheels, because they're fairly certain that wasn't going to work, hop over a burning wreck and then make a belly landing on the other side. So they told Arthur, the pilot, what was going to happen, and Arthur wrote, "Put me back in the seat." So they carried him through the aeroplane. They used a shoelace to tie the stump of his arm to the control column so he could push. He came in on his approach. He leant forward. He pressed the 2 buttons for his wheels. He got 2 greens as they locked. He hopped over the burning wreck, landed on the other side, and pulled his aircraft to a stop just at the end of the runway. He thought it might blow up, so he turned off the petrol and the magnetos, opened the cooling fans for his engines, and just as he did so, he died. However, he'd saved everybody on his aircraft. The only problem is the aeroplane that shot at them that night was another Royal Air Force aircraft from his own squadron. That's not in the face of the enemy. That's friendly fire. and that means you can't have a Victoria Cross. In this instance, it went all the way to Winston Churchill, and Winston Churchill looked at the card, and he read the story, and he crossed out George Cross, and underneath it in green ink he wrote, Victoria Cross. We can't let the enemy know we shot down one of our own aircraft. And at the age of 20, Arthur was awarded a posthumous VC. Now, exactly 1 hour and 25 seconds ago, I started this talk, and I said to you at some point during that in that first paperwork that Her Majesty looked at and annotated, she said, it's not about the medal, it's about the deed behind the medal. That's the important thing. And I hope you now believe that Her Majesty got that just about right. Thank you for listening to me.
Thank you very much for that, Mark. I think on behalf of everyone attending this evening, that was fantastic. It was such a fascinating topic. And what a time to do it as well, obviously leading up to Remembrance Day and everything that comes with that. So again, on behalf of all of us at UGLE, just thank you very much for your time on such a fascinating topic. We've had a number of questions come through that I will communicate over to you now.
Okay.
Malcolm Craig asks, Mark, are there any VC holders alive today? And if so, can you say anything about their heroism?
So today we have 10 Victoria Crosses who are still alive. The oldest one is a man called John Cruikshank. He will be just over 100 years old now. He won his Victoria Cross in 1942 in the Royal Air Force. And the newest Victoria Cross was won in 2015 out in Afghanistan. I think if you talk to them, they all say, I didn't do anything special. I just had to do something, and I did it. I wanted to help my friend. I needed to do this. Something had to be done, and I was the one who did it. So they're always very, very modest people. But when we had when Her Majesty had her Diamond Jubilee, we had 7 Victoria Cross holders come to the Royal Artillery Museum, and we had about 22 George Cross holders. And they were the kindest bunch of people. They weren't big, they weren't rough looking, they weren't tough, they were just ordinary blokes and girls for the George Cross. And they were just in awe, really, that we were in awe of them just to such an extent. But I think that they are they are a special breed, but they also find themselves in a moment when it's their time. I do another talk called Hearts of Oak, where we explore how you win Victoria Crosses in the 4 separate ways you can do it. And then I try and ask some questions of the people that I'm talking to see whether or not they all start off by saying, I couldn't do that. But by the time you've gone through how these other people have done it and why, you suddenly start to think to yourself, it's about a circumstance. It's not a circumstance you ever want to be in, but it's just about a circumstance. And if you're in that circumstance, some people will stand up to the mark. Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, we were chatting beforehand, and you said, Mark, that you've actually delivered this very talk to Johnson Bahari, who obviously is a Victoria Cross winner. So yeah, that must be a very special occasion to see him. It's quite
a day when you do that same talk, and every time you look to your left, there's a guy sitting there wearing one. So it's quite a day.
Fantastic. We've got a question in from Neil. What colour is the RAF ribbon, and is a pension awarded?
Okay. So the ribbon started out as red and blue, and on the 1st of April 1918, when the Royal Air Force was formed, they went to King George V and asked what colour he would like for the Royal Air Force Victoria Cross ribbon. And the King at that moment said and decreed that from that moment on, all of the ribbons for all of the Victoria Crosses would be red. It really upset the Royal Navy. But since the 1st of April 1918, Army, Navy, Air Force, it's a red ribbon. And when a ribbon only is worn, there's a tiny miniature little Victoria Cross worn in the middle of the ribbon itself.
Okay, interesting.
Pension, yes, so when it started, they got 10 guineas a year, which in 1854 was quite a lot of money. Today, they get something like £5,000 as a tax-free lump sum every year, but it's only awarded to a Victoria Cross holder, so not to their widows or dependents. Right. So if you've got one and you die, like, bless John Cruikshank, if he's 100 years old, his pension will stop on that day.
Okay. Someone has asked, could you explain the system whereby VCs are awarded by ballot?
So this is clause 13 in the Victoria Cross statute. And what it says is that in an action where no one person has distinguished themselves, an amount of Victoria Crosses can be allocated, which will then be balloted for by the people who were in the action. So the last time they did this was in April 1918 for an attack by the Royal Navy and the Royal Marines at a place called Zeebrugge. And they gave 2 medals to officers, 2 to Royal Marines, and 2 to Royal Navy other ranks. And everybody's name, literally, in the other ranks sort of area, that all the names went in the hat, including people who had been killed as well. All the names went into the hat, and 2 names were taken out. And those 2 lads, those 2 officers, those 2 Royal Marines were awarded the Victoria Cross. Everybody else, their service papers were stamped with a rubber stamp, and it says participated in the ballot for the Victoria Cross for the attack at Zeebrugge. So you can tell if someone was put in for the VC because you can see it, literally see it on their papers, but only however many are allocated get the actual VC itself. But the last time we did it was 1918.
Thank you. Is it true that the VC is saluted by all ranks?
Yes, it is. So if you are a humble private and you walk onto a camp and any officer comes towards you, they have to salute not you, but the Victoria Cross. The other bizarre thing is, if any of you have ever been soldiers a long time ago, you used to go on pay parade, and you used to have to wear your hat on pay parade. It's bizarre. However, if there is a Victoria Cross holder on the camp, you don't have to wear your hat on pay parade. How bizarre is that? Who knows?
That is quite weird. Mark, question from Colin. Was there a case where a VC was awarded to a soldier based solely on his own testimony? He said he forgets the conflict, but he thinks it was in the late 19th or early 20th century.
Okay, so there was a chap who was in the Indian Mutiny. So the Victoria Cross has to be witnessed by an officer, first of all, and then it has to be witnessed by other people. So this chap was in the Indian Mutiny. He was an officer. He wrote to the War Office after the mutiny had finished, and he said, I was really brave and I definitely deserve a Victoria Cross. And they wrote back to him and said, well, okay, so you need to go and find some witnesses who are prepared to give a statement of how brave you were. So basically he went off and he found 10 of his friends who he got to write a statement saying how brave he was. He posted it all off to the War Office and they posted him back a Victoria Cross. So yes, you can do it.
Not sure that would work now.
Yeah, done that.
All right. Would you agree that some of the early awards would have barely received a military medal in the Great War and World War II?
Yeah, that's a very good question. That one is one of
controversial.
Yeah, you see, I think when it came out in 1850, when the statute was signed in 1856, and it was backdated to 1854, there was a larger expectation that you could get one of these things. And you could say to your friends pretty much in the morning, watch me and I'll get one. Bob Roberts, Field Marshal Lord Roberts, he won his Victoria Cross in the Indian Mutiny and had genuinely said to his friends, I will win one of these things. And not denigrating it in any way, size, shape or form. But when you read this, what he did to get it, you do think to yourself, yeah, really? But back in the Victorian age, remembering that there is only the Conspicuous Gallantry Medal and the Distinguished Conduct Medal for other ranks, there isn't anything else for officers to get. So it was either mentioned in dispatches or a Victoria Cross, which is why by the time World War I comes along, we've tried to give people a distinguished service order, but the statute's wrong and it's not quite right. So in 1914, they institute the military cross. So then you have a military cross, a clunky distinguished service order as an award for gallantry, and then the Victoria Cross. But it gives them some sort of a progression. If you find a distinguished service order from the First World War for a second lieutenant, a lieutenant, or a captain, or equivalent in the Royal Navy, he has just missed a Victoria Cross. That's how it's worked. If you have a Victoria Cross to a lieutenant colonel or a colonel or something like that, then it's a proper award then, and it's an award for staff work, not for bravery. And that's really what the Distinguished Service Order is. It's about distinguished service, not about being brave. So they've sort of made that clunky. So not until 1992, when John Major changed the awards sort of profile, so that there's now no longer a military medal, a distinguished conduct medal. Now there is a military cross, the new one, the Conspicuous Gallantry Cross, which fills that void between an MC and a VC, and then the Victoria Cross. And suddenly, you can argue you shouldn't have done it. Military medals are fantastic things earned by all that, but it actually makes the whole thing sort of fit if you're an officer. If you're another rank, you've got a military medal, a distinguished conduct medal, and a VC. Perfect, not a problem, or whatever it is for the other rank. But that officer thing was always a bit sort of disjointed in between a military cross and a VC. But yes, certainly. So you read some of the distinguished conduct medal citations from the First World War, and you think, oh my God, that should have been a VC. Oh wow. Yeah. Wow. And then you read some of the Victoria Cross citations from the Victorian period, and you think, yeah, really? must have had a lot of friends, bless him. I'm not knocking it, but yeah, the guy's right. There is a disparity that you can read by reading the citations. Yeah.
Okay. Interesting one here. If someone in the Special Forces was awarded a VC, would the citation be published in the Gazette? And if not, where are those citations accessible?
Okay, so the Special Forces people always, they do have their citations published for the things that they do, but they're not published as Special Forces. They're published as what their parent regiment is. So they will be gazetted in the London Gazette. If there is something in the citation which is deemed to be secret, then the citation may be truncated. So they may take out sensitive information, but there still is a citation somewhere. The only problem is that the SAS and the SBS, they don't really get them. There's no. They tend to get the Conspicuous Gallantry Crosses at the moment, and those you do see, and they do have a citation in the London Gazette somewhere, but under their parent unit, not SBS or SAS. Try to say a Royal Marine or Para, something like that.
Yeah. Personal one for you, really. When and how did you find your first VC medal?
So me and my dad, I got my dad's medals when I was 6 from my nan, and my dad bought me a poster. He bought me this poster, which is full of medals. Yeah.
Oh yeah.
And one day,
that's awesome,
we sat down and we said, right, we're going to collect every one of them. Okay, but this one up here was always going to be a problem because that's the Victoria Cross. So that was always going to be a stumbling block. So many years later, I had an uncle who died, and he had no children. And bless him, he left me his house and quite a lot of money. Okay, and I had to wait till I was 21. And on my 21st birthday, I was given this pot of money, which I proceeded to, as George Best said, I spent it on, girls and women and beer, and the rest of it I wasted. And there was a moment where that was going to happen, you see. So I bought some rubbish like you do because you're 21. But I had a fair amount left, and it was 1990. And I said to my dad, look, we need a VC for the poster, and I've got some money and I think it will be an investment, so let's give it a go. So we went off to an auction, and the first one we tried for we didn't get, but the second time we went, we got George's VC. So I've had it for 30 years this year.
Very interesting. How were the 11 VCs decided at Rorke's Drift, or were they just simply because they were the only survivors? How was that decided?
No. So the commanding officer who ended up with command is a man called Lieutenant Chard of the Royal Engineers, and his second in command was the officer from the 24th Foot, Lieutenant Bromhead.
Oh, right. Michael
Caine and Stanley Baker. So Stanley Baker, the character played by Stanley Baker, he wrote the list of all of those who had been at Rorke's Drift for Her Majesty the Queen, because she wanted to see it. I've got a copy of it somewhere. If I knew you were going to ask the question, I'd have found it. But I have a photo copy of this thing, and then he Chard picked out the people who were going to receive the Victoria Cross. Wow. And he wrote for Bromhead, and Bromhead nominated him.
Right, okay.
The two that you really want are Reynolds, who was the surgeon, and a guy called Dalton, because it's possible that Chard and Bromhead were fairly new at what they were doing, and it's probably Dalton who actually defended Rorke's Drift. He gave them the ideas, but yeah. And one of their Victoria Crosses, so one of the 11 Victoria Crosses for Rorke's Drift today would cost you around about £750,000.
Wow. That's wow. Okay. We're going to put you on the spot here, Mark. Who do you consider was awarded the most deserved VC?
Oh, that's a tricky one. So the chap that I usually pull out the bag on that one is a guy called Sergeant John Raines. He was in the Royal Artillery in 1915. He was part of an attack at a place called Lewes, and they were attacking two coal slag heaps in French they're called fosse, and they have numbers. So he was attacking fosse 7 and 8, and he joined up to the Royal Artillery with a kid that he'd gone to school with. His name was John Raines and Crawshaw, John Crawshaw. So Crawshaw was on one gun and John Raines was on another one, and he saw a shrapnel shell burst over Crawshaw's gun, and all of the gun detachment were wounded and fell over. Now, the problem with all of this is that there was a gas attack going on at the same time. So they were all wearing what are called PH helmets, which look like a pillowcase that you pull over your head and tuck into your jacket. No steel helmets in 1915.
No.
And John Raines ran over to his friend, saw the others were dead, saw Crawshaw and said to him, "I'll come back for you, mate. Don't worry." And went back. And he said to the guys on his gun team, "Look, next time we get a check file, someone come and help me." So 2 lads from his gun volunteered. They all ran over to Crawshaw. They got there, they knelt down, and a shrapnel shell burst over the top of them, killed the 2 lads who'd come with Raines, wounded Crawshaw again, and wounded Raines. Raines picked up Crawshaw, took him back to his dugout, got him into the thing, turned round, went back up the steps just as a phosgene gas shell came down the steps past him and exploded. And it destroyed Crawshaw's gas mask, PH helmet. So John Raines went back down, took off his own gas helmet in the gas, put it on his friend, and then carried him to the dressing station. They looked after Crawshaw and they said to Raines, "Look, you're gassed and you're wounded. Sit there." He went, "No, I'm going back." So we went back to his gun with no gas mask on, and he kept it in action for about 4 hours. At the end of it, they said, "You've got to go." He said, "Look, no, I'm not going. I'm the only sergeant left alive." They said, "Right, big house over there. Go and sit in the basement, and if we need you, we'll come and get you." So he went off, sat in the basement, about 10 blokes in there, and a German shell came over and collapsed the house onto the cellar. So the battery ran over and started to dig. They dug out, first of all, John Raines, and he'd now been wounded about 15 times. They put him on a stretcher. He climbed off and he started to dig, and he rescued 4 men on his own. And they got him out and everything. And bless it, they said to him, "Right, you're off. You're done. You're finished." And he went, "Yeah, all right. I've had enough."
Fair enough. Can't blame him.
He died in 1929 from gas poisoning. He'd been a policeman before the war, and they made him a policeman afterwards, but he just worked in this little thing. And from his cottage to the cemetery is about 1.5 miles. And there's a newspaper cutting that says, on the day that Sergeant Rains was buried, the route was lined by 30,000 people, and 12 Victoria Cross holders carried his coffin.
Wow.
I think he was a bit bad.
Wow. So someone has asked, obviously you referenced the cannons that were used to make the medal originally. Are those cannons that they took the metal from still at Woolwich? And is it true? Apparently you transported a piece of the gun in your car, and that's from Laurie Bourne.
Yes. Hello, Laurie. Yeah, thank you so much. Yes. So the two guns, the two Chinese guns, used to stand in the foyer of the Royal Artillery Museum, and they stood there for years. But when the museum closed in December 2016, one gun went to a museum down on the south coast called Explosion, and the other gun went to the Tower of London. So they're separated, but they are still around. And yes, the bit that they cut off of the gun is called the button. So a cannon is a barrel when the cannonball comes out at this end, and at this end there's a hole where you light it, and then there's a thin bit and then a lump.
Right.
And lump, it's a counterweight, and they cut that off of the back of each of the two guns. And in 2006, for the 150th anniversary, I did an exhibition at the Royal Artillery Museum, and I had the two guns. The Royal Regiment has won 62 Victoria Crosses, and I had 23 in a tin, and I managed on the day to end up with 38 Victoria Crosses. And I managed, after a lot of effort, to get the actual remaining block of button that is kept at Donington that they make the VCs from. It looks like a quarter of a lemon. It weighed 16 kilograms, and I had to insure it for the weekend for £85 million.
Oh, you want to drop that?
Yeah, they said to me that when the bloke handed it over to me after an awful lot of paper filling out, he said, "You are going to keep it in a safe, aren't you?" And I said, "Yeah." And I'm thinking to myself, I haven't got a safe, so just between me, you, and however many people are listening, for that whole weekend, I kept £85 million lump of metal in my desk drawer because I didn't know what else to do with it.
Oh my goodness! Fantastic. Got time for a few more questions. How many applications for a VC have been unsuccessful? Is that sort of information publicly available, or?
No, lots, I would imagine. So in the Royal Artillery Museum, we had the original citation book for the Crimean War, and the Royal Regiment of Artillery, I can't remember exactly. I think for the Crimea they got something like 5 VCs, but there must have been about 40 recommendations. So not many. Many more people will have been put in for a VC than ever got one. You've got so many different things that get in the way, because if the guy who witnesses you doing something gets killed, it's all over. There was so in 1919 they had to clear the battlefield at Lewes, the one we just talked about, and on the battlefield, which is about the size of about maybe about 10 football pitches, something like that. They'd already found 19,000 bodies, which had been lying out 4 years before they got to pick them up. And they found a lieutenant colonel dead, obviously, as a skeleton. But in the pocket of his tunic, from his notepad, he'd written the citation for a VC for his sergeant. And the sergeant was killed, but the sergeant today is still missing. To this day, he's still missing. So he's on the memorial at Lewes at a place called Dud Corner. But because they found the citation in the colonel's pocket, the sergeant was awarded a posthumous VC. Right.
Wow. Can you account for all the awarded VCs, or are some missing?
No, there's 1,365 have been issued, but there's 26 that are missing. One of them, his grandchildren took it out to play with in a field, and they lost it in about 1920.
Oh, no.
Yeah. A couple of them were blown up in buildings during the Blitz in World War II.
Right.
One was in a fire in a house and it melted. And some of them were buried with people.
Right.
They had them buried. So there are 26 which are on the list, which nobody has any clue where they are. Yeah.
Thank you for that. So I think we have time, Mark, if it's okay, just for one more question, and it kind of touches on an earlier question that we had. Was there an equally prestigious medal given out before the creation of the VC? Was there any kind of
anything? No. So for the British, the first medal that we have for proper gallantry is the Distinguished Conduct Medal. This is Corporal Minute. He was wounded at the Battle of the Alma, but he got that one. Then the Royal Navy have this thing, and this is a Victorian one from the Crimea. They only issued, for the whole Crimean War, they only issued 11 of these. Right. So that's a rare thing. And then we have the Victoria Cross. But the oldest medal of gallantry in the whole of the British Empire is an Indian award, and it's called the Order of Merit. And if you hang on a second, I'll show you one.
Yes, please. Yeah, fascinating.
So it was instituted, first of all, in 1837, but it's only for Indian soldiers.
Right.
And this is it.
Wow.
So that's the oldest gallantry award of the whole British Empire. It stopped in 1947 when the empire finished. This is a First World War one. This was one in Mesopotamia by an Indian soldier. Right. No Indian soldiers could get the Victoria Cross until 1916. So this was their VC.
Right. Okay.
From 1916 onwards, they were admitted to the statute. But what tended to happen was that we tended to give the VC still to the officer, and the soldiers got that one. But obviously, as time went on in the 20s, 30s, and World War II, the Indian soldiers got, proper VCs. I don't mean proper VCs as in that, but they were still being awarded this as well.
Yeah.
So they could get both of them. It's a nice thing.
It's amazing. Mark, thank you so much again for your time this evening. It's been absolutely fantastic. I'm sure I can speak for everyone attending to say that we'd love to have a look around your office. It looks an absolute treasure chest.
Yeah, it's quite cool.
Tokens and items, and
every drawer is full.
Yeah, I mean, how many medals do you have in your office, Mark?
About 7,200.
Wow.
I know.
Amazing.
It's a hobby that's got out of hand.
Well, you've done very well out of that hobby, to be fair, Mark.
I know a lot about them as well.
Yeah. No, well, Mark, again, just on behalf of everyone at UGLE, just thank you very much for your time this evening and your fascinating presentation. To all the other attendees, thank you so much for coming. We hope you've enjoyed the presentation. We hope you've enjoyed the talk. The link will be on demand from tomorrow, so we'll share that on our UGLE social media channels. That's on Twitter and Facebook. So if you want to see it again, or if you want to share it with people in your lodge, please feel free to do so. And keep a lookout for the next edition of The First Rising, where we will be sharing details of our next talk. But again, on behalf of us all, Mark, thank you very much for your time. And to all attendees, thank you very much for yours. And please do stay safe. And we hope to see you soon. Okay, bye, guys.
Bye-bye.